So, as I've said on a couple of occasions, some of the most useful words that came up through my seeking process, or at a particular point in the seeking process, was this notion of let's keep it practical. And the reality of the situation is that until that point, the seeking and the teachings were very impractical. Now, remember, certain words are heard by the doer, and so impractical sounds like it's a bad thing. And because something is not something else doesn't make it bad. It's just a description of what it was. It wasn't practical. Now, it fit into my process perfectly. The impractical teachings fit into the process perfectly and were needed. And I didn't realize that they weren't practical. I thought that they were descriptions of reality. And it was only when my attention was brought back down here to a practical explanation that I realized, wow, what I thought was practical, because we can get these words mixed up as well. So we think, let's keep it practical. Practical means pragmatic and realistic. And so when there's an awakening to certain aspects of life, it feels like we now know life truly. And so the notion that the concepts are not practical doesn't make any sense. If anything, we would say, the old way of looking at life was illusion, was error. And the old way was pretty much about treating life as it appeared. And the certain teachings, for good reason, describe life as we've known it as unreal, as illusion. And in doing so, allow something different to be seen. So if you kept pretty much reinforcing what someone knows, and maybe just introducing subtleties sometimes, when introduced within a framework that is more or less the way people see life, may not be effective. And so sometimes it's good to sort of try and wipe the slate totally clean and say none of that is correct. And as a result of reframing life such that the practical is in a way overlooked, that just becomes content. So the content is irrelevant, is what the teachings are essentially saying. We want to find out what is true, what is real, what is unchanging, what you really are. And that is beyond the changing, beyond the content. So leave the content behind. Don't worry about thinking about what is happening in the flow of life. Let's see the bigger picture. And that can create some very significant changes. So much so that what is revealed is believed to be the truth, reality, and our thinking then thinks that that is practical. So if someone becomes aware of the awareness that they are, in which all of life arises, and identifies or knows themselves in their mind directly, knows themselves directly as that, meaning, oh, this is not a concept. This is what is informed in the moment. That in the moment there is an information, a direct information, a direct knowing with a capital K, which doesn't imply an intellectual knowing in the way that the word knowing is used. It means free of any ideas of who I am. There is a knowing that I am the formless awareness. And if we don't temper our thinking, our conclusions about that, what tends to happen is that we run with what the experience is telling us and we assume that it's true. Because now the experience is free of a set of labels, that have been conditioned for our whole life. Like, you are a human being, you are a person, you are a body. So they have been sort of weakened by a teaching that says, that's not the truth. And so the system has essentially learnt not to define itself that way. And then, free of those definitions, what shines through is the essence that has always been here, the essence that has always been the background of each moment. And in that experience that is free of any labeling, the assumption is that, okay, now I'm not labeling it as this or that. And so what has happened is that the truth has been revealed. Now, we might not realize that experience may not be as untainted or unconditioned as we might think. One of the useful conclusions that we can form with the working mind is to not rely on those things that are relative, to not rely on our thoughts as being absolute, to not rely on our senses as being absolute, because they're limited. They are outputs of limited instruments with limited capacity to see the whole. And at that point where the labels have been uprooted, or this habitual tendency to label life as we have come to know it, having grown up in this world and experienced it a certain way, we automatically wake up in the morning, and when this imagery appears, our history, our historic knowing of life, our historic way of feeling life is essentially projected onto this present moment. And so when teachings have successfully convinced us not to do that anymore, convinced the system not to do that by rightfully pointing out that you can just be in this moment, allow this moment to be without knowing what it is, without labeling it, without saying this is this or that. And in time, our system might become more cooperative in allowing us to just be, in allowing there to just be a being with what is. So much so that qualitatively it can feel quite different. And one of the reasons it feels quite different is because a whole layer of very subjective thinking, subjective labeling, subjective defining life a particular way, essentially limiting it and reducing it down to what we think it is, has fallen away. And when that limitation, that limiting factor, that reducing factor falls away, what presents is something that comparatively feels unrestricted, non-reduced, unlimited. That's what it feels like. And we're very good at taking what something feels like to be truth. We did it when the experience was being labeled, when our thinking was saying, this is a world of form, and everything happens the way I think it happens, and that, I have to hate someone who has hurt me because that's an attack on who I am. So there's all sorts of dialogues that happen that are based on a certain assumption that the system has. And because it feels that way, we say, oh, that's how it must be. And then it takes a teaching to come in and say, we've completely overlooked the nature of reality by boxing it in, by closing it in, because of this faculty of thinking that reduces everything down to something. And essentially, the thinking has reduced it down to something because that's what it has felt like. And so the thinking says it feels like that, so it must be like that. And when that labeling falls away, something else presents. And we then say, oh, it feels like this, so it must be this. It feels like what I am is not the body. It feels like what I am is the awareness in which the whole universe arises. And we will add often, this is not a concept, this is experiential. Having sort of overlooked that the previous set of concepts about who we were, so the previous ones were, I am a body, and when someone talks behind my back, then that's an attack on who I am, and if I don't get certain things, then that means I can't be happy in life. That was experiential. And then in hindsight, we look back and we say, oh yes, it was experiential, but that's because of certain thinking that made it a certain way. And so we can't really say it was experientially, it was conceptual. But that's only in hindsight, looking back at the old experience, we realize, oh, it felt a certain way because of these concepts that had been ingrained into us that forced us to reduce the experience down to being a world of form and me being a body. But if we don't look at it in hindsight, and we go back and you ask someone, do you have a concept that you are a body in a world of form? Or is it your experience? Is it conceptual or is it experiential? Then you would have said, well, what do you mean it's conceptual? It's not conceptual. I feel, I experience. So even if I drop my concept, I feel like, so it is experiential that I am a body in a world. And as I said, if that shifts, we look back on it on hindsight and go, wow, that experience was completely illusory. It was completely influenced by deeply ingrained conditioning that made me feel like I was something that I'm not. And yet now, having had this change where experientially it feels like I am not the body, I am consciousness. That's what a seeker in that phase will say. And they're not making it up. That's actually what is now presenting for them. And the assumption is that that is the truth, that the truth has been revealed, because it feels so different. And in hindsight, we say, oh, that was illusion. And we're told that what we wake up to, what we shift into, is a seeing of what is, free of the veil of separation or the veil of duality, the veil of knowing oneself as a body. So what I'm now suggesting is that what if that is not as absolute as we think it is at that point. Now, the irony of all of this is at that point, the experience is that there is no thinking that it is that way. There is no we who is thinking. There is just what is. So if I say, hey, you think that you are formless awareness, the person would say, well, you're projecting a whole lot of things. There is no one here to think. There is just the knowing of what is. Now, I really understand that what they're saying is they're putting into words as best as possible what their direct realizations are. Now, when I say realizations and insights, I don't necessarily mean that realizations and insights are absolute. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, realizations and insights are not absolute. We have many throughout the process, and they build on each other, and they refine what starts off as a particular insight, gets refined, and down the track, the insight as it presented initially is probably not what we are running with at that point in time as being the way things now are seen. So I think it's very important for us to realize that at the time, insight seems like truth, seems like something undeniable, seems like, oh, now it is known definitely. And to realize that that changes, that insights change, they build on each other. And that they too are not something absolute. And so that what I'm calling a phase of knowing oneself as formless awareness, which is often believed to be what the journey is all about, may in fact be somewhat relative. So where is all this going? I had pointed out that at the beginning here that some of the most important words were let's keep it practical. And knowing oneself as formless awareness, although it seems like reality and truth revealed, which then means how much more practical can you get than truth? At some point, we might realize that knowing oneself as formless awareness is not particularly practical when it comes to daily living. Now, the question is daily living relevant? Because from the point of view of formless awareness, daily living becomes irrelevant. And it becomes all about knowing what we really are. And I remember at some point having a chat with Ramesh and realizing I couldn't admit to myself, I couldn't bring myself to say it because I really didn't believe it, that I am Roger. The journey had taken me to an experiential realization or an experiential state that seemed like a confirmation that what I truly am has nothing to do with daily living and has nothing to do with a body, has nothing to do with a person. It seemed like the journey was all about realizing that which was hidden. And that which was hidden was or is awareness. And when it becomes more evident, when the awareness presents itself on center stage and knows itself, where awareness becomes aware of itself, it really does seem like I am not a body. The awareness seems to be primary to the whole experience of life, including the body. It seems to be more fundamental, which really means, if anything, the body comes after awareness. That awareness is fundamental, primordial, primary, and the body is secondary. The body is just an appearance along with the rest of the world. Now, this awakening, essentially, to what I would say is an aspect of who we are, a primary or a very significant aspect of who we are, is crucial because until we become more familiar with the consciousness aspect, the awareness aspect, the being aspect, they're all facets of each other, we essentially are a human being that only appreciates the gross aspects of the human being, only knows the physical aspects. And the core, or what is most important in terms of peace of mind, is there but not appreciated, is there but not recognized. And a recognition of this core allows for a very different movement to happen, a very different movement over extended periods of time. And what I mean by a different movement is that it allows for the habitual thinking based on the idea what I am is a physical entity needing things in the future. That deeply ingrained, limited belief of ourself forces a habitual thinking, forces life to be lived based on a past and a future and somewhere to go, and a measure of success or failure, a sense of self, essentially, that a sense of self that is thought-based, meaning it emerges out of our assumption of who we are. And that assumption is not something that a me creates, but rather an assumption that is infused gradually by life, such that it becomes the identity that is functioning in life. And that identity, which is a thought-based identity, only knows how to think about itself in life. And because it sees life as a source of its completeness, and so it looks at life as a time-based unfolding, where it knows the past and it knows what has happened in the past and it knows what that has meant about its idea of itself. And it sees the future as what is yet to come and is defining. So it looks to the future for improvement. It looks to the future for a removal of the uncomfortableness that has come with this conceptually based idea of ourself that at its core feels inadequate. And because at its core there is a sense of inadequacy, there is a sense of uncomfortableness, a sense that something is not quite right. And that things are not quite right feed the sense of inadequacy and needing to get something that we don't have. So it's a feedback loop that keeps us stuck in looking at life and judging it as being something that needs to be different because I inherently feel uncomfortable with the way it is. So it can't possibly be how it should be. So knowing ourselves only on this gross physical level means that the aspect of ourself that allows a resting, allows a stopping, allows a self-fulfilling sense of contentment, a self-fulfilling sense of completion and purpose to be there, is completely overlooked. So that essentially means the jewel in the crown is covered up. It's like having a jewel in the crown that has been taken out of the crown and put in the pocket for safekeeping, and then someone wearing the crown as part of the decoration without the centerpiece. So in practice, if the core of the human being is not appreciated, if there isn't a connection to it, if there isn't an access to it, then the jewel in the crown is missing. So that's why there's so much emphasis on are moving away from identification with name and form, identification with thinking, because as life has developed us, that identification keeps us knowing ourselves in a limited way. So an awakening to this formless aspect of ourselves is a great relief, is a great shift. It is the beginning of a capacity to know oneself and to know life differently. So it's hugely important. But does it come with its downsides? And the answer is yes. To bring about that awakening, certain things need to be hammered home. Certain concepts need to be used. And it's those concepts that then embed ideas about the shifted experience that may not be as true as the concepts that were put forward said they were. And remember, in me saying that they're not as true as they said they were is not saying, oh, well, that's a bad thing because it hasn't told you the truth. It's done what it's there for a reason. The concepts are structured that way for a reason, because the human being has developed without an appreciation, without a contact, without a connection to the very core of who we are. So essentially we have become fixated with one side of the coin. So we are the coin that has two sides, and the coin has become fixated with only one side and only knows itself on one side. And so teachings have realized this and said, how do we get the coin to know itself differently, to know its other side, so that it can know itself as a two-sided coin? And so the teachings have seen the obsession with one side being the physical, and then because of this obsession with being something that we're not essentially, because we are a coin, and the coin now knows itself as one face only. So knowing itself as one face, it doesn't know itself as it really is. And so the teaching, having seen that there is this obsession with only one face, is, hey, you are not that face. And everything inside the coin is saying, of course I am. And the teaching says, no, you are not that face. And so it describes the other face, the face that is unseen. And it knows that in order for a shift to happen, it needs to say, you are not the face that you are familiar with. That is ignorance. That is an error. And because there is this uncomfortableness that comes with how we have known ourselves up to that point in time, meaning there's an uncomfortableness with knowing ourselves as that one side of the coin, intuitively there's something that is willing to hear the teachings and say, yes, finally, something is pointing to a way out of this uncomfortableness. And if we're lucky and the right blows are struck, a seeing of the other side happens. And when the other side happens, it's like, oh, I am this and not that. And I always thought I was that, and now I see that's ignorance and I am this. This is what I am not that, I am this. Which may in fact be the same principal error, but in a different form. And what I'm suggesting is we are the two sides of the coin, and in denying either side or not knowing either side, we only know part of who we are. And so the human being is physical and formless. And we are not one or the other. We are a human being that is physical and formless. And even if we say physical and formless, it sort of implies two, the physical and the formless, whereas really we are a human being that is both but neither, because there aren't two, there is just a human being. And when we look at the human being, just like if we look at a tree, we can look at the tree and say, oh, that's the bark, that's the leaf, that's the sap, that's the branch. And they're just conceptual labels of a tree that is what it is. And the human being is what it is, which includes this core of consciousness. And so let's keep it practical. Meant is there a Roger sitting on the chair? Now, from a certain perspective, I was convinced there is no chair and there is no Roger. All there is consciousness. And within consciousness, but not separate from consciousness, is an appearance of a world with a Roger and a chair, and it appears like there is a Roger sitting in a chair. And that insistence that that is what life is meant and was a result of this obsession with the new side of the coin. Because what Ramesh was saying is, come on, Roger, don't you have to live your life as if you are Roger, living in a world of chairs and tables and trees and other people? Oh, no, that's just an appearance. Let's not take that as real. What I am is consciousness. Roger, don't be ridiculous. Roger is sitting in a chair talking to Ramesh, and Ramesh listens, and then Ramesh talks to Roger, and Roger listens. Oh no, that's just consciousness speaking with consciousness. All there is consciousness. And to Roger that couldn't admit he was Roger sitting in a chair, the truth was, the reality was, there is no Roger, there is no chair, there is just consciousness. And so Ramesh, who was destined to be my teacher, and at that point was already my teacher, even though it was early on in our meeting, had an influence, I realized in hindsight, that meant when he said those words, Roger, let's keep it practical, hit home. And at some point I realized I can't bring myself to say I am Roger, and if I really look at it the way he was pointing out, there is a sense of Roger in a chair, and it occurred to me, what if I am Roger? Who is convinced that he's consciousness, that there is no Roger, that all there is consciousness. And so fortunately, and let's keep it practical, we can also explain from a practical point of view, what is it that we're really looking for? As seekers, our seeking started because there was an uncomfortableness in life. There was something that was not quite right. Questions started arising. What's all this about? I've lived X number of years and it just doesn't seem fulfilling. It doesn't seem like living life the way I've lived it up to this point in time is going to be satisfying after another 30 or 40 years of doing it. Am I not likely, after another 30 or 40 years of living in the same way, going to look back and say, something just doesn't feel right? And in my case, it was this realization that having set certain goals and targets, nothing groundbreaking, but things that were what I thought life was about, getting to the next stage. That's how I had lived my life from being a young teenager. I remember starting off a small business with my next door neighbor at the age of 12 or something, going around washing cars and cutting people's lawn. And it was very exciting. One day we got together a bucket and went round and washed a couple of cars and made $5 or $10, which back then was, and we invested that $10, went down to the local petrol station and bought sponges and soaps and buckets and went out with our new kit and made some more money. And then we got a job where a young lady wanted us to rake the leaves, and we spent hours raking every leaf in her garden, and we just felt great. We did a great job, and she was extremely happy. And then we found an older lady that wanted us to come and wash her car every weekend. And, then finished high school and went to university, finished university, got a job, thought of some ideas that were well received, got promotion, on and on, made some investments, made some more money. And at some point of having set some targets, and in this case a financial target, and having hit it much quicker than I had hoped, I had this sort of excitement for a short period of time, and then realized I just set another goal. And I thought, wow, that didn't last very long. It was about a few hours before I was thinking of the next goal. And what I had, the goal I had just met became irrelevant. And now it was about the next goal. And I thought, really? Is this how you're going to live your whole life? And there was a sense of hollowness, a sense of never getting there feeling. And it wasn't intense suffering by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it was I guess, fortunate that I was able to see, because of the way the the sequence of events unfolded, was fortunate that it hit me. Well, I could get caught doing this for the next 30 or 40 years. And I might, at the age of 80, say, wow, I've spent my whole life trying to get somewhere and never really getting there. Not because the goals weren't achieved, but because as soon as the goals were achieved, the carrot ended up further ahead. So the seeking starts because there isn't a sense of life is okay as it is, life is good as it is, that what I am doesn't require life to turn out a certain way. So I could see if these goals, if these objectives started not being met, then how would I feel? I was feeling good and excited because things were turning out well, but still no sense of deep fulfillment and the realization that this was a fruitless way of spending time, if that's all that there was. Now, if those goals started not hitting the mark, I could see that then there would be a much bigger problem to deal with. So the seeking actually is driven by the fact that there isn't a peace of mind with life as it is. So keeping it practical, when we look into this, we find that the more intense forms of suffering are not necessarily the goal setting, the expectations, but the uncomfortableness with oneself and with the other, the blame towards the other, the sense of guilt and shame and inadequacy towards ourselves, the pride towards those actions that we take as my actions that have led to positive outcomes, and we say, look what I've done. You see, you need to appreciate me because my life is all about achieving goals, and look at the goals that I'm achieving. And I have done that. And when we really feel into that, that doesn't feel authentic. That doesn't feel comfortable. And pride comes before the fall. To have this sense of myself as the doer, as soon as an outcome doesn't turn out well, then our pride turns into shame, into guilt, into embarrassment. So the freedom in knowing oneself as formless awareness is a freedom that comes because the story of seeking for outcomes, the story of guilt and blame and pride tends to fall away. Because life is no longer about the physical content. The physical content, or what seems like physical content, the appearance, the mundane, is what we engage in when we know ourselves as a physical entity. That's what the narrative has been in the teachings. So to know ourselves as formless awareness means I don't have to concern myself about setting up businesses, about the future, about getting somewhere, about being anyone. In fact, it's like, I am no one. I am just that formless awareness that is aware of everything that's happening. And so, in appreciating that aspect of the human being, which at that time is not appreciated as an aspect of the human being, but rather is believed to be the awareness of God, or the awareness that is prior to the body, so therefore that which is real in the body is just an appearance. Indirectly, it allows a stopping of the thinking mind. It allows a stopping of the thinking mind by refocusing, or by focusing attention onto the formless that doesn't have to live a life of outcomes, of daily living. Say, let the body do its thing, I am not that. And so any of the old thinking about expectations can be seen to be, oh, that's when you don't know yourself. That's when you think you're a human being, a person. And it allows a return to what in this teaching would be called the absence of the thinking mind. And so, in a roundabout way, it has an effect of creating a reduction in suffering, more peace of mind. But not peace of mind for the human being in daily living, but rather peace of mind for formless awareness that exists prior to daily living. Peace for the formless awareness in which daily living arises. Now, I contend that that's actually not how we are destined to live life. It's a phase that is allowing us, and maybe being part of, a movement towards living life as we're destined to live life, which is as the human being, potentially free of suffering. So if we keep it practical, if we look at it and say, oh, actually I am Roger, and Roger, as he has known himself and interacted in life, has been unfulfilling. And when we look at it, what is it that is causing this sense of lack of fulfillment? And we see it's a certain set of thinking, a thinking that can get cut off by the assertion and the experiential arising that suggests you are not a body. So that narrative of what the human being has been seeking can fall away. But do we need ourselves, do we need to stop knowing ourselves as a human being for the problematic narrative to fall away? It's definitely one of the ways in which the narrative gets attacked. Asserting that we are not a human being, that we essentially are consciousness, is definitely a powerful way of weakening the habitual thinking and awakening us to an aspect of the human being, although at that point it's not known as an aspect of the human being. So let's see if there's a movement where whatever has happened in our seeking so far can be refined a little bit and say, actually, there's no problem with admitting that I'm a human being. That's not the cause of suffering. The cause of suffering is when there is a human being that knows themselves in a certain way that forces the seeking and the attitude that was there previously to remain. What if we can be a human being that has a different attitude to life, an attitude that no longer arises the uncomfortable thinking to arise. A falling away of a particular attitude that equates to or results in the falling away of the uncomfortable thinking. That if that's possible, we may then find ourselves being able to live life as a human being in a world of form, doing in each moment whatever is necessary, whatever is destined, with an attitude that doesn't create a cutting off of an aspect that is so important. And in living life that way, connected to this aspect that is important, knowing ourselves as a human being, then we can say, my experience of life is one free of suffering. So I spoke to someone recently who's, in fact, a teacher of non-duality. And when I explained this, they said, I have to take your word for it that you can know yourself as a human being and be free of suffering. And why they said that is because their journey has taken them to a place where whenever they know themselves as a human being, suffering arises. And when that narrative of being a human being in a world of form falls away and they drop back into, or in fact, they live their life from that place of witnessing, they say, they report there is no suffering. And so I think what I presented was hopefully in a convincing way, because I started off trying to impress upon them the fact that the appreciation of life from that perspective is something that I can talk to from experience. Because if it wasn't, if it isn't, if I can't demonstrate that there has been an awakening to this formless awareness aspect, then the assumption is, oh, he just doesn't know life as seen from a witnessing perspective. And it's some sort of intellectual covering up of suffering, some intellectual idea that is essentially just another identity living life. So if in the discussion I was able to demonstrate by focusing on certain aspects that really someone who's experienced that shift would know, you can only really point all of those aspects out if you are familiar with that. And then say, and from there, the journey was about coming back and being Roger free of suffering. And the discussion was illuminating for me, because the honesty of the discussion demonstrated that, wow, their experience is that to be human is to suffer. And that freedom from their experience means to not know yourself as a human being. And my conclusion is that by not knowing yourself as a human being, by essentially denying your humanness, having what we call awoken to the formlessness, the nothingness, which refers to the awareness that is aware of all of the content, which is essentially an experience, and therefore we come to see that what seems like a world of physicality is actually all appearance and consciousness, and therefore not physical at all. And so the word, nothing is used because it's all the something is actually seen to be no thing, not really something, but rather continuous movement within formless awareness, therefore making it all formless and not something, therefore nothing. And so to not know oneself as human means to not be able to carry on the narrative of what I need, why life is not complete the way it is. And so with that narrative dissolved, there is the absence of suffering. And so my suggestion is that that person is a person in which the narrative has been interfered with by the process, and the assumption is that they are not a person, and therefore that's why the freedom is there. So my assertion is you can be a person. You can know yourself and refer to yourself in life as a person that was born and will die, and be free of suffering, because it's a particular type of thinking that takes place within the person's mind, thinking that we call the thinking mind, which is guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, that can fall away because they're undermined using a different technique, a different set of pointings. And this may then refocus what we're really looking for, and allow us to say, what I'm looking for is the end of suffering. And if I can have the end of suffering while knowing myself as a person, who cares whether I'm a person or I'm not a person? Who needs to stick with I am consciousness? This was my conclusion after having thought about what Ramesh was pointing at, and realizing that my suffering that remained was a suffering that was waiting for a life that was had even less humanness in it. And when I saw that the suffering was about a certain type of thinking and a waiting for a life that was more nothing than was already the case, when I saw that was the problem, and that fell away, then I realized there's no problem in looking at myself as a human being. The problem is having an expectation that reinforces the notion that something is missing. So on this note, someone mentioned pain, and they said their experience of life is that they don't experience suffering in the form that I describe it, so no psychological suffering of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, but there is plenty of physical pain. Back pain, I think it is. And could I say something about that? And the teaching makes it very, very clear. So in their communication, they said, so that pain is suffering. I suffer from back pain. And that's that's a generic use of the word suffer as is used in the English language. And the teaching says, within the context of the teaching, suffering specifically refers to a psychological movement that is referred to as our attitude to the flow of life. And the flow of life is the circumstance that we find ourselves in, and the physicality, the senses, the thoughts, the emotions. And the suffering is our attitude to that. So it says the flow of life is pleasure or pain. And our suffering or our peace of mind is always on the level of our attitude to the flow of life, and never on the attitude of the flow of life itself. That's where the freedom lies, is that we have got an attitude that is involved in how the flow of life should be. And so it seems like our unhappiness is because of the flow of life. Because of this unique nature of unhappiness being our involvement, our sense of identity as being something defined by what happens in the flow of life. And even though in actuality, if we look at it, we'll find all of our unhappiness is not because of the flow of life, but because of our attitude to the flow of life. And that nuance falls away, and it feels like I'm unhappy because you did this, you didn't do that. I'm unhappy because I did this. No, we can be completely at peace with the circumstance being the way it is, completely at peace with the other not having done something or having done something, with me not having done something or done something. That's all circumstance. That's pleasure or pain. The other not having done something they said they were going to do is potentially pain in the moment for me. If I do something and it leads to a negative or a bad outcome, that's pain in the moment for me. My happiness, meaning peace of mind, or my unhappiness, meaning resistance and involvement in the circumstance, is not because of what someone did, didn't do, what I did or didn't do, but rather because of my attitude to that flow of life. And that makes it very clear that the teaching is about not fixing the flow of life, but rather changing, bringing about a change towards the attitude that we have. And the attitude is an attitude of personal doership. I did it, you did it. And that the attitude that says my happiness, my contentment is to be found in life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. That is the attitude that leads to suffering. There's the freedom. My happiness is never to be found in the flow of life. So in answer to this question, what about pain? That is something that the teaching doesn't look to fix. The teaching says you can't fix the flow of life so that it is the way you want it. The flow of life is not in your control. Sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Sometimes you get much more than you want, and sometimes you get much less than you want. And sometimes you get what you want. Not because you did it, but that's because it's destiny unfolding. So back pain, painful as it is, this is not a suggestion that physical pain is not painful. It is. I know someone else who suffers from a very frustrating physical ailment that I can imagine is very frustrating. The suffering, separate to the pain, is an additional layer that, if it's there, adds a whole layer that intensifies the situation. Well, I won't put it that way. It doesn't intensify the. It's a whole layer of suffering that is additional to the pain of the circumstance. So I happen to recently, in the last few years, have developed back pain because of a disc that has degenerated. And it's painful. But I can imagine that if there was an attitude that was in resistance to the fact that my mobility and my capacity to do certain tasks is sometimes limited by the pain, if there was an attitude that was not at peace with the fact that these things happen, that these things, they may not happen for some people. It could be that my destiny was for that not to happen. But as I see it, my destiny is my destiny. And so it may not have happened, but it did happen. So now the notion that it may not have happened is irrelevant. And I see it did happen. And so now my attitude is, okay, so on certain days I can't do certain things. And in a way, to want to do certain things when physically I'm not capable of it could be seen as wanting, as for a human being who can't fly, who doesn't have wings, who is extremely upset at the fact that they can't fly. So we all know that human beings can't fly. Can you imagine if you turned up in life and somehow there was this expectation that says, I want to fly and I can't fly. And that the fact that we can't fly becomes really frustrating to us. Now, not many people would be afflicted with that sort of suffering because flying has never been anything that anyone can do. We were never able to fly. And so we don't think like, I'd like to be able to fly. And it doesn't have to be, I'm using flying as an example. What if we imagine some sort of pleasure that we don't have? And we say, I want that, and get frustrated over that. Now, we don't tend to do that. What we do is we look at what the others have and say, oh, I don't have that. I'd like to have that, but I don't have it. Or we look at what we had and say, oh, I'd like to still have whatever, youthful appearance or mobility. Because it's sort of something that we have, well, it's something we have a memory of, or we see someone else having. And then we have an expectation that life should be like that. Or we have a desire or a preference that life should be like that. But the fact is it's not. And so if we can reconcile, if we can bring our head around and say, oh, I see, once it changes, that's how it is. And it's as unavailable to me now that it's changed as flying was through my whole life. And yet I didn't suffer over the fact I couldn't fly. And yet I'm suffering over the fact that I can't go for a walk. And so if we can reconcile with what is, without wanting it to be how it used to be, then a layer of suffering falls away. Now remember, this isn't to say that when I don't want it to be different, the pain is going to go away. We can be thankful for maybe a capacity to be involved in some other work, some other activity that diminishes the pain. So if that happens from time to time, we can be grateful that we got lost in a movie or a book, or that we had the freedom to spend time sitting down instead of having to work at physical tasks that were going to aggravate the pain. We might be thankful for painkillers and this isn't I'm not advocating for or against painkillers, but I see no reason, well, not no reason, but there can be validity if your pain is strong enough to take a painkiller that you see works at reducing the pain. You also then have to be aware of what consequences that has and weigh up the overall benefits. But I know that if there's something you can do to improve a situation, then by all means do that and see what happens, see if the situation improves. So in short, the teaching says enlightenment as it's defined in this teaching, and as I've said before, I would much rather not call it enlightenment, because it's simply, as I see it, living life as a human being in a world of time and space and form, interacting with other human beings without this layer of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, which essentially reveals an experience of life that allows us to say, hey, I'm not unhappy in life. So the teaching or that form of enlightenment is not going to give you special powers. It's not going to give you freedom from the struggles of life, especially the pains of life. It's not, Ramesh would say, it's not going to magically mean that you're going to find a parking space every time you're looking for one, or that you'll be able to be in two places at once, or that you will become a saint, or that other people will become saintly towards you. It's simply the falling away of the additional load that is described as our attitude to the flow of life, the additional load of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. And often there are layers of this suffering that we just don't even appreciate are there, which make the pleasure or pain seem like it's the problem. So we might not realize that there is a narrative towards something in the flow of life, a narrative that says, oh, this could be different. What should I do to fix it? Now, remember, do your best. If there's something you can do to fix a situation, or something you think will fix a situation, by all means, do what you think will improve the circumstance. But understand, the outcome is not in your control. So this attitude of non-doership, the attitude of seeing life unfold moment after moment according to God's will, or according to destiny, not in your control, doesn't mean you are not free in each moment to try and improve the situation. But understand that whether the situation improves or not is also part of destiny unfolding. So, by all means, try and fix the circumstance. But once we try and fix the circumstance, sometimes we can get carried away in being attached to the circumstance changing. And when that happens, inadvertently we become resistive to, let's say, the back pain, because the movement is, how can I fix this? What have I not done that will fix it? And at some point, we just have to have the thought, this is my destiny. There's nothing for me to do. I've done everything I can, and yet it persists. So I've done what I can. I've sat back and waited to see what the outcome is, and consistently the outcome is it doesn't change. So let me just see it as destiny for that to be there. And having surrendered to the fact that it is destiny for the back pain to be there. So you say, nothing, no more involvement in the back pain. The pain itself will be there, and the attitude is, this is my lot. I can't do what some other people do. Having surrendered to that, having accepted that, doesn't mean that in the next moment doesn't mean that someone won't tell you to press this pressure point 5 times and then press here and close your eyes and visualize a golden cloud. And you might say, oh, why not? I'll try it. And you try it, saying the outcome will be what it will be. And let's say it fixes it. So having surrendered to this is my destiny doesn't mean that in the next moment a fix won't come. But it doesn't mean a fix will come. And whether it comes or it doesn't come, your attitude is, this is the flow of life. Sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And for some people, much more pain than for others. And if these subtle layers of suffering towards the circumstance are understood to be a layer that makes it heavier than it needs to be, if that becomes seen, then those subtle layers of suffering might fall away. And if they are there and they fall away, it will truly be noticed. We might not realize that a seeking for the end of pain, which makes so much sense because we have our preferences, and the body is going to move towards pleasure and away from pain. So it makes sense for the body on a physical level to not want pain. It's that because of the subtlety of turning the preference into an expectation, or turning the preference into something that we are insisting on, an attachment to that outcome. It's such a small shift that we might not realize that preference has turned into an attachment. Because it does make sense for the body to prefer not to be in pain. And so we might not have seen that that makes sense, and yet it's gone a little bit far, where it is now something I have a relationship to. A bit, like having construction noise outside. They're building a bridge or a highway outside, and it's going to be there for the next 5 years, the construction noise. And then after the construction noise falls away, the highway noise is going to be there. Yeah. So getting involved in the highway noise, in the construction noise, is pointless. Well, it's not pointless. It creates suffering. Okay, let's take a couple of questions. Hi, Holger.
Hello, Roger. there's so many things on my mind. I would like to respond to what you said in the satsang, but I can't. It's just so precious, your words. They are so finely crafted, and it's such a pleasure. Your words kind of become a part of my life. I mean, when I listen to you, it's almost, I often have the feeling I'm just listening to Jesus. In this Christian background, just the presence of this deep peace, which they just call Christ in the Bible. But it's just so beautiful. It's amazing. But in regard to being practical, there are two things that bother me or disturb me. Or it's one aspect is whatever I do, it seems to impact our environment. That's one idea, just as an idea. And then the other one is charging money for my services is also something that always creates trouble in me, because I then see there's so much pain involved in money, at least from my perspective. And maybe you can say something about those two things.
Mm-hmm. They really demonstrate our internal attitude to those topics. The resistance in a way to them, because they're both inevitable. And I say this from experience, because I really needed to unpack both these topics for myself, because there was a time when I wasn't clear on it. So finances, money, as you said, are a significant pain to a lot of people, because this is a world that works on transactions and money, and a lot of people don't have as much money as they would like. Some of that is created by attachment to outcomes, and there's therefore a desire for material things that people can't afford, but they're not essential. And in a way that's, a consequence of attachment. But some people just don't have enough money to buy the basics. And if money has been a pain in our life, it's also probably that pain has turned into suffering, and we therefore have a relationship that says money is the cause of suffering. And money and circumstance is never the cause of suffering. At worst, it's the cause of pain. The suffering is an attitudinal thing that happens when our attitude to pleasure and pain is a certain way. And therefore, if our relationship to money is the cause of suffering, then we have an issue with money. And as it becomes clearer that that's my attitude, that's my issue, and we work through that, and we see why, for example, we had a certain attitude to money, and we come to justify certain things, like charging for our services, because that is the world we live in, and we can't fight what is. So, that's, at some point I wanted to live off-grid, being able to live free of money. And so I spent a couple of years experimenting with not buying things and, making things, recycling things, exchanging services for other things. And it dawned on me at some point, you don't need to live like this. You have the capacity, if you apply yourself in a certain way, to earn an income, and to impose a certain way of living when it's not needed. especially when it's a certain way of living that is not supported by the system as it is in a way a resistance to what is, a resistance to life, insistence or an attitude that says life should be different. And so there are several different insights that we can have towards why we feel a certain way, and hopefully see where the internal shift needs to come from, and what seems like an issue with money and with the environment may stop being an issue. So what's, I remember someone making a comment somewhere about charging for the retreats, for example, and it was a comment from someone who was just came across. I think it was after the Batgap interview, and so there were a lot of people that weren't familiar with the teaching that saw the interview, and at the end, I think I was asked what I've got coming up, and I said there's an event, a retreat at my house, a 3-week retreat, which I hold 1 or 2 a year. And so someone must have gone to the website and seen that there's a charge for that 3 weeks, and commented, and this guy charges for the retreats. And when I saw the comment, I understood that it comes from someone that has a certain relationship to money, that has an idea that it's not part of spirituality or whatever. And it was understandable to me. Like, from my point of view, I know why I charge for the retreats. It doesn't make sense not to. It's not feasible to do certain things without charging for them. There's costs involved in running things. You need to be able to survive in life. So this isn't a justification of that. It's once I become clear on certain things, then someone having an issue with it doesn't cause an issue internally. It's like there's a clarity about, this is why these things are the way they are. And so once the complication around those things has fallen away for us, then we have a good relationship to it. And that's what's most important. So at the beginning of the answer to your question, I pointed out it's usually an internal relationship to these topics that creates an uncomfortableness, where we think the topic itself, where we think money, for example, is the problem, where we think pollution or environmental damage is the problem. And it's much more about our attitude to that. That's the problem. And when we look at, you mentioned the Bible, there's a quote or a saying in the Bible that's often, we're lazy, humans are lazy, and so it's not appreciated in its full context. And that is that money is the root of all evil. And in fact, it's the love of money is the root of all evil. And we drop off the love of money and just say, money is the root of all evil. Now, the love of money refers to our attitude to money, not money itself. There's also in the Bible, it says a rich man is as unable to enter the gates of heaven as it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Basically says, if you're rich, you're excluded from heaven. Now, what does it mean by a rich man? Does it mean someone who has wealth? Or does it mean someone who identifies with their wealth as being who they are? And so these nuances and how we relate to them is very important. So I think it's just a matter of time before these uncomfortablenesses are seen for what they are, and hopefully they fall away.
Thank you, Roger. There's so much more freedom and joy here on my side. It's really beautiful. And could we say that a human being is the one who is aware of the two sides of the coin?
Yes, as far as I'm concerned, the awareness is an aspect of the human being. So when I say the human being is aware, I'm talking about the awareness aspect of the human being. But if someone separates the awareness and the human being, then they're going to say, oh, the human being is not aware, it's the awareness that is aware. But if we see that the awareness is part and parcel of the human being, then we can say the human being is aware.
It's like stages in consciousness or something, like on one, because every word, words don't exist just, they have a meaning. And so you have the word person and you have the word human being. And what about if the person is the one not yet aware of the two sides of the coin? Mm-hmm. And the human being is the one, through the awareness of the both sides of the coin, is in harmony with the flow of life.
Yes, it is up to you to define the words that you use. And it's also up to you to understand how, let's say, I'm using the words or someone else is using the words. Because if you define the word person one way and the word human being different to person, doesn't mean that someone else will use the two words in that way. So it's very important for us to listen, and through context and asking questions and discernment, figure out what definition is being used. So when I say we are a person, we are a human being, I use the word person and human being as being two words that describe the same thing. What I then say is we're a person, we're a human being, but that person or human being can either have the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, or the person, the human being, can be free of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And there'll be many people that will listen and say, no, I am not a person. The person is the problem. And that's because in other teachings, the word person is used to describe the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, meaning the narrative that says, well, what I need is this, and what I need you to do is act this way, and that narrative is the suffering. And so, if we're told we're not a person, then the story about a person falls away, which really means the story of doership falls away, and then there's a degree of freedom, and we think, oh, that's happened because I really am not a person. Because when I stop being a person, which means when you stop thinking in the old way of how we've known ourselves as, then freedom falls away. So we say, oh, it must be that the belief that I was a person was the problem. And my whole point when I had this conversation with this non-dual teacher was to say, my experience is I can clearly refer to myself as a person. I know myself as a person when I get into bed at night, when I wake up in the morning, when I get into my car and drive to the shops. A person, meaning a body, is getting into a body that thinks, a body that is aware, a body that knows how to drive the car, is getting into the car. So that's what I refer to as a person, is a body in the world. And that's what I refer to as a human being, a body in the world, but it's a body that is also a conscious body. And that body, that person, that human being, either has the attitude of doership or is without the attitude of doership. And so with all of those words, it's up to you to, navigate through that and maybe see the nuance of, when someone says, when I stop being a person, there is freedom. Maybe what they're saying is, when I stop thinking along the lines of what I need because society has told me you are a person and you need this, that they're really saying, when I stop thinking along a certain line, there is freedom. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not a person. It just means maybe they're a person that's no longer thinking a certain way. So it's all a lot of fun, isn't it?
Important thing just about the back pain. At one point, I was a massage therapist, but I stopped this business. Mm-hmm. In my understanding and experience, the body itself is neutral. It just, as in heaven, so on earth. It just reflects our attitude. Mm-hmm. And instead to just ask, I want to get rid of my pain, how can I... How do I find release? I think it's much more important to see what is causing the pain. And there is always, for me, I discovered I had many years back pain issues, very uncomfortable, and they're gone right now. And my discovery was they're psychosomatic. I mean, this was my understanding, and listening to your teaching released a lot of inner tension, and which reflected itself in the body too, because it's my deep belief that we are gifted with a healthy, functioning body, and we all only screw it up ourselves through our attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's merit to what you say, because I have experienced a lot of sensations in the body that suddenly just disappear. The one that's most evident to me was when I was walking and I felt like my shin had broken, and then there was an energetic release, and before that it felt like the shin bone had been fractured. I couldn't put any pressure on it, and it just felt as if it was bone. And then some energetic release happened, and that pain was completely gone, as if it was never there, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with any bone, and nothing more ever happened of it. So it's very clear that physical pain that feels completely physical can very often be energetic. And I won't rule that out, except the MRI shows me that the cartilage between discs is no longer there. And having said that, our assessment of what causes pain, including back pain because certain discs are damaged, may not be an ultimate cause of pain. So I'm open to that, but we also have to see that sometimes the physical structure can be damaged through traumas, physical trauma or something like that. That is obviously going to lead to certain restrictions. But the energetic or psychosomatic loads that we carry also translate and manifest as very intense pain sometimes. So I'm open to what you had to say.
Our peace and joy can never be damaged.
Yes, I completely agree. Especially if we're not attached to the pain going away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. Hi, Akshay.
Hey, Roger. So it's clear to me that pain and pleasures in terms of the body are just a limitation of how the body is, and that's natural and to be expected. But is that the same for like mental pleasures and pains that can be caused by circumstances, or is there no way out of that?
Sorry, what's the difference? The first one was pains of the body, and the other is pains of circumstance.
Like by circumstance, I guess I mean, like if let's say there's a animal crossing the road and I hit it with my car, then that might be a painful moment to me because it's my preference to not hit the animal.
Mm-hmm.
But is there no way to get rid of that preference? I'm not saying I want to, I'm just curious.
No, well, you might be able to change preferences. That happens over time. So, at some point you had a preference maybe to play on swings and in sand pits. And then, that preference changes. And now playing in a sand pit might actually be pain instead of pleasure. So our preferences do change, but in each moment it makes sense for there to be preferences. It's a biological thing. And if we think that suffering falls away by us not having preferences, then there's an error there. And teachings will sometimes ignore the nuance because it's helpful to do that. And so they'll say, your suffering is a result of your preference for this over that. And they'll say, it's an indifference to pleasure or pain that leads to peace or leads to freedom. Now, technically, that's not. Technically, it's not accurate. Technically, it's not correct. However, as a teaching, it may be more appropriate at a certain point in time, because to go into the nuance of our attitude to our preferences may be too much, and at a certain point of seeking, for some seekers, what we need to hear is that pleasure is the problem. Our preference for pleasure over our preference for pain, not being there, is the problem. And what that does is essentially it turns us into a renunciant for a period where we push away pleasures because we are convinced that it's my preference for pleasure that is my suffering. Now, even though that's not accurate, what it does is it breaks our addiction to pleasure. It shows us that even without pleasure, there can be an inner contentment, a joy, and that's very important. So the teachings that say, your preference for pleasure over pain is the problem are not technically accurate, but they're very appropriate. And at some point, once that addiction has been weakened, we can then start to bring in this nuance that says, well, actually, it's not your preference, but your insistence that your preference is delivered, which is more about your attitude to the pleasure and pain. And once your insistence, meaning your addiction or your identity, is defined as, in order for me to be complete, I need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. If that falls away, then we realize, it's fantastic to be able to enjoy pleasure when it's delivered. So that's why there's the notion of Zorba the Buddha, Now, Zorba, the Buddha, is the Buddha that is the Buddha of enjoyment. So it's put in there for us when we are ready to question this notion about indulgence and pleasure when it's available. And it's really an indication if there is a Buddha of enjoyment, then our thinking at some point will say, is enjoyment the problem if you can have a Buddha of enjoyment? And another hint is the notion of the Mahabodhi. Now, the Mahabodhi is a term in Sanskrit that refers to an enlightened being, the Mahabodhi, the super enjoyer. However, the word Bodhi on its own, without the Mahabodhi, which just means enjoyer, is a term reserved for the unenlightened, because they are the enjoyer of life. And its definition as enjoyer for just the bogi means someone who only knows themselves relative to the pleasures and pains of life. And so the enjoyer is essentially identified with pleasures and pains. The Mahabodhi, which is a term, the super enjoyer, which you would think must be he's super unenlightened, right? The super enjoyer. But actually it's reserved for the enlightened being, because the enlightened being, no longer being identified to its preferences or no longer identified with life needing to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order for there to be a sense of completeness, understands that the body has its preferences, and when life delivers pleasure, enjoy it fully without any thoughts about when it will end, what it will mean when it will end, without any resistance saying, oh, I can't enjoy that because that would be unenlightened. So the liberated person is able to enjoy the pleasures fully without any thoughts that interrupt that enjoyment, knowing that the pleasure at some point is going to turn into pain or is going to fade away, and understanding that that is the normal flow of life, and that who I am is primordial to circumstance. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does. So, like, basically, having preferences is a biological thing.
That's right. And insisting that your preference is delivered is a psychological thing.
Okay. And then just a quick follow-up. I haven't really had any experience of like a witnessing state. In that state, I guess pleasure and pain also falls away?
Not necessarily, but it becomes a much less... it's pleasure or pain known from a different standpoint. So yes, your assertion is to some extent correct. It gets tempered because essentially we are knowing it from a vantage point outside the body. And so it is, in a way, less pleasurable and less painful. But as that witnessing tends to... witnessing, as far as I experience it, tends to fall away at some point. It becomes irrelevant. And that point is usually when the suffering is... the suffering dynamic has fallen away, and then it's like, who cares about witnessing? Witnessing is more important when the tendency to get psychologically involved in pleasures and pains is there. And so the witnessing perspective is a sort of freedom from that involvement. and it comes at a cost, because it comes with a moving out of the body experience. So if that tendency of the human being to get involved falls away, then the witnessing is not particularly needed anymore. So I wouldn't say that when witnessing is happening, pleasure and pain doesn't fall away, but the psychological involvement in the pleasure or pain tends to be reduced, if not stopped.
Thanks for your answer.
You're welcome. I think we'll take one more question. Hi, Martin.
Roger.
Hi there, Martin. Go ahead.
I think it's very interesting what you had to say about your back pain, and it's my experience that someone's always got advice for you as to how they conquered it, and I do know what it's like to have severe back pain, because I had 2 prolapsed discs, and I was lucky enough to find a neurosurgeon in Bristol in England who performed an operation called a microdiscectomy. But I know that your condition, as you described it, was different from mine. But a few doctors did tell me that I would probably end up in a wheelchair until I found this particular neurosurgeon. But that's just an aside. But I think it's really interesting what you had to say about the motorway being, or the highway being constructed. You got the construction noise, and then when the motorway opens, you've then got the noise of the vehicles, and it reminded me of a guru in India who was asked by somebody who lived over a motor body shop with all the hammering and banging, and he said, "What can I do? It's just driving me crazy. I can't meditate. I just can't concentrate. I can't sleep." And the guru just said, "It's easy. Move away."
Yeah.
And I think sometimes this is what we can do, is we can get involved in things so much that we can't see anything clearly anymore. And that was just really, really helpful. But I think the question I was going to ask you was really, you were giving a talk a couple of months ago, and you're talking about sort of support structures, and I think you said there were 10 of them. I don't know if there are 10 that you've identified, but when they start to collapse, we become very, very lost. And I just wondered if you remembered saying that, and if you do, could you talk about that a bit?
You've completely got me on this. Because are you sure you didn't hear someone else say that? Because I don't.
No,
it doesn't ring a bell as to what.
Definitely you, Roger.
Yeah?
Definitely, but not to worry.
Yeah.
I think it's just very interesting, all the things you have to say, and this thing about being totally practical. It is the best teaching I've ever come across. It really has given me all the confidence, really, to let life unfold. I was recently listening to another spiritual teacher, and he was pointing to all the things that you and Ramesh talk about in this practical teaching, but he wasn't actually identifying it. He wasn't actually, if you like, naming it. It's quite extraordinary. So, this is the most practical teaching, and thank you for everything, Roger.
Well,
thank you enough.
You're very welcome. I'm glad you see it as practical. I remember, though, there's a time for the other side, when that's more relevant for some seekers. So I know that from experience, to come across teachings that move away from the practical and work on our belief system by pointing to the nothing, the no humanon, the phenomenon versus the no humanon, the absence of the presence of presence, and Nisargadatta's teaching. I saw a quote from someone saying, "I'm double dead." Nisargadatta said, "I'm double dead." So those things get us thinking. Like, what does double dead mean? It means, like, I'm dead to being the person I used to know myself as, or whatever that concept conjures up in your mind and creates a contemplation of. So I appreciate your comment, because I think it is very important for us to keep it practical. That's what this satsang was about. And at the same time, it isn't about rejecting anything that's different, because if we can see that it all has its place, really see it all has its place, not just say it, but say, it's like a car going along a conveyor belt in a factory. When the doors are getting put on, it's a certain process. And when the paint is getting put on, it's a different process, and it requires different techniques, different tools, different all sorts of stuff. And we can't look at the door part and the shiny bit and go, "Oh, that's the most important part," because if the pieces didn't get put together at the earliest stage, there'd be nothing to spray paint and make shiny, and vice versa. So yes, it's a funny process, and it's great that life delivers everything that we need, all the phases of the conveyor belt. So thanks.
The concept of double debt is an interesting one. In fact, it just occurred to me this morning. Perhaps you might want to talk about this one day, because I think it would really, really help me. Is how this false self is ingrained into us by conditioning, being validated by other people as to how they think we should be, and our response to that is to be a people pleaser or a rebel, one or the other.
That's a good point. Yes,
and how we define ourselves, this false self, by how we see ourselves operating in this, if you like, real world. I forget the term you put to it. This world of form. How we operate in it as a result, and constantly seeking this validation of getting people to perhaps like us, or to feel that we're doing something useful, and for other people giving us approbation for that. So that's the perhaps you could talk about that one day, because that is, for me, the ultimate practicality. Is how we see through that, if that's the right term.
Yeah.
To understand who we really, really are.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point.
So thank you, Roger. Going on a bit.
It takes we see through it when we realize that actually there's uncomfortableness in living like that. Once our awareness lands on the uncomfortableness of functioning that way, where on some level we think, "Oh, that's how I have to function to get what I want," and yet on a deeper level, we can hopefully find a sense that says something doesn't feel authentic or right, and then it's at that phase or that point that something can come in, a concept can come in and say, living according to attachment to outcomes, one of which is love from the other, is essentially a reinforcing of your false sense of self, an idea of who you are that is devoid and detached from your true nature or your true self, basically pointing at a psychological self that has developed, and says, if you keep doing that, then that basically means that this psychological self continues to be reinforcing itself. And so if there is a sense of uncomfortableness from having lived that way, maybe it's worth experimenting with doing it differently. Who says that you have to please everyone? Who says that your happiness is going to come from being approved of? Maybe your happiness comes from stepping outside of your role and living life how you feel like living, doing what is authentic to you on a level of your preferences, let's say. I had said to someone today who touched on this and said, that's what I feel like doing. That's how I want to live. I want to be able to live doing what I feel like. And I said, if I get told I'm going to die in a month's time, I'll look back and I'll say, for the last 20 years, and mostly for years before that, but especially the last 20 years, I can say, I've lived life for the last 20 years doing in every single moment exactly what I feel like. And so if I'm told, look, you've got another month to live, I'm sorry, but that's what it is, I'll say, well, could be worse. I could be looking back, regretting that I lived life not doing what I felt like. And so to me, in practical terms, that's one of the consistencies in life that has manifested that is most valuable, to know that when I'm tired, I do my best to sleep, do my best to rearrange things such that I can sleep. When I'm hungry, I eat. If I feel like seeing people, I'll try and arrange to see people. If I feel like being on my own, I'll try to be on my own. If I realize that my preference is to spend more time on my own than with people, I tend to make a note of that. And going forward, I accept invitations to be on my own and reject invitations to spend too much time not on my own. And that's an intelligence that all of us can develop quite easily once it becomes apparent what it is that we prefer, to the extent that it's available to us, because in some cases you can't do what you prefer because there will be consequences that will be more painful to you than you would prefer. So in the end, when you look at it that way, you say, I'm still doing what I feel like because I've chosen to do work when I might not want to work, but it's very considered. And so then I'll say, even when I'm working, I'm doing it because I feel like it. If I could not do it. The option is there, and I just have to suffer the consequence. So, yeah, this topic is very important.
It's really good to hear you expand on that, and it's interesting what you said about pleasing people. That I do this to please you, but in the process, realizing that you displease others. Mm-hmm. It became quite clear to me that I used to entertain my mother and her friends. I used to sing and dance for her when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I had all this sort of repertoire. And she said, "Yeah, come on then, Mark, you sing for her." And I do that, and I can now remember my older brother sitting in the corner seething. And when my mother and aunts and friends and had all sort of, he would beat the living crap out of me. So, and then she would say, "Why are you two fighting?" And I thought, I'm just trying to survive. But so interesting, Roger. Yeah. Thank you so much. You really are very important. Very, very important.
Thanks, Martin.